So we've got with us Alex Logeman. He is our policy counsel at PeopleForBikes. Really knowledgeable, so I'm excited to have him speak to us today. We've also got Jordan Trout for any tech support as needed. So first up, before we jump in, we always like to say thank you to our members. It's really, you guys that make our work possible. So thank you so much for supporting. And for anybody who is just joining, I did a quick intro for myself. You're probably noticing that I am taking these webinars over from Eric Burdell. My name is Lindsay Goff. I'm the new digital marketing manager at PeopleForBikes, and it's really nice to meet you guys. So our format today is 20 minutes, and then we're going to do a 10-minute Q&A. So if you want to go ahead and start dropping your questions in the Q&A section, down on the bottom, you should have an option there, or you can drop them into the chat, either one. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Alex Logeman.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks to everybody out there for joining today. We've got a lot of information to cover, and hopefully this will be super informative for everybody out there to think about what's been going on and what's to come over the next year or so. Again, my name is Alex Logeman. I am our policy counsel, and I've been at PeopleForBikes for 6 years now, working in a lot of different areas of our policy team, but lately have been our staff leader on all of our trade and tariff work. I also dabble a lot in the e-bike space and infrastructure space as well. And, Lindsay said thank you to our members. It's our members that allow us to do this great work and pursue the policy initiatives that will help the bike industry. So if you aren't a PeopleForBikes member, please consider joining because without that member support, we would not be able to do any of this. So thanks. Here's a quick agenda of what we'll cover. We'll do kind of a deep dive on the Section 301 tariffs. Obviously, that's the biggest issue that has emerged over the last 2 years. I'll give you a glimpse into what's going on with the miscellaneous tariff bill. This is another program that we can see some tariff savings on for the industry. We'll talk about the generalized system of preferences. That's a tariff program that provides relief for developing countries, including some countries that are important for the industry. We'll talk about the EU civil aircraft dispute. That was another Section 301 investigation that the US commenced and has resulted in proposals for tariffs on bike products a few times now. And then we'll talk about some key issues to watch in 2021. So a little recap of the Section 301 investigation. It's been going on for so long, it's sometimes easy to forget what has happened and how this all started. So this was commenced in August 2017, more than 3 years ago at this point, and that was when the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative started its investigation into these various issues that have posed problems for U.S. businesses when working in China. The final report came out about 7 months later in March 2018, and it was focused on a few key areas, mainly about technology, licensing, requirements like how much Chinese interests needed to own businesses that were operating in China, whether businesses were being forced to turn over certain types of information in order to get business licensing, what China's outbound investment into the US looks like, and then, of course, sort of hacking and allegations of intellectual property theft. So nothing specific to the bike industry, although it's certainly possible that companies have encountered pieces of this. Here's a timeline of everything that's happened so far. The first real substantive tariff actions date back to July 2018. Our industry wasn't particularly hard hit by that one. It did include GPS units, but most of our products flew under the radar for that first proposal. And the tariff increases have been pretty significant for most of the journey along these 4 different lists, usually hovering around 25%, though that started getting a little bit lower as we went into list 4. List 2 came out in August 2018. That was the list that included e-bikes and e-bike motors. E-bikes were subsequently excluded in sort of a convoluted process through an exclusion for e-motorcycles. I'll talk about that in a little more detail later. List 3 was when our industry really got hit pretty hard with these new tariffs. That started in September 2018. It was first a 10% tariff increase and then bumped up to 25% in May 2019. And those were the tariffs that affected all complete bicycles and most of our parts and components. List 4A was the last major list, first a 15% increase, then reduced to 7.5% in February 2020. And this basically swept in everything else that we, in the bike industry, that wasn't included on list 3. So some of the remaining component categories, and then also some really important accessory categories like helmets and lights. And then there was also a list 4B. Initially, list 4 was proposed as one set of tariff increases, but that got broken apart by the administration as they implemented it. And the list 4B tariffs actually never went into effect. So those were suspended indefinitely as part of that phase 1 trade deal that was reached in late 2019, early 2020. But again, we didn't really get much benefit from there because we didn't really have any products on list 4B. So what have we been doing as part of our advocacy for the Section 301 tariffs? This has been a very administrative process for the most part. There's definitely a political lobbying piece with Congress to this as well, but it has been highly centralized in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and that office has created a number of administrative processes, held hearings, provided public comment periods, and that's really been the way to try and get some relief from these Section 301 tariffs. So we have organized live testimony at all of these live hearings in DC. We've flown executives out there. We've had PeopleForBikes staff there. I've been there to testify about what these tariffs would do to our industry. Every time we've had the opportunity to provide public comments, we've obviously availed ourselves of that and have provided a lot of detailed comments about how our industry functions, how China sits in our supply chain, why a lot of our supply chain is in China as a result of things that happened in the late 90s, and some things that happened to our industry during that time period. We actually appealed to the U.S. government to received some protection when trade opened up with China in the 90s, and the U.S. government did not listen to our request back then. Then, of course, we get hit with punitive tariffs 20 years later. That it's a complicated issue for industry to navigate and very, very difficult. There's also a sort of a public outreach piece, and we've wanted to have the broader industry weigh in as to what this means, for suppliers and retailers. Frankly, it's mostly translating into higher prices. These are getting passed on to customers. So that's really the bottom line effect. And then, of course, there's this exclusion process that you can apply to the U.S. Trade Representative's office to try and have your products excluded. We've used that and tried to coordinate the industry and using that process very, very extensively so that where it makes sense, PeopleForBikes can file those requests as the industry trade association. But in some cases, we won't have the data we need. It may be that a more specific product description makes sense as an exclusion request. So we've also tried to help our members file those and give them the information they need to pursue that avenue as well, because the benefits can reach beyond the filer. Obviously, anybody who's importing the product gets to take advantage of those product exclusions. So a lot of different pieces to this. And now we're sort of in this extension process phase, or we at least wrapped up the first part of it, where we're trying to have those product exclusions that we did receive get extended for as long as we can. So what are the results? Our industry was very, very successful utilizing the product exclusion process. We had some major categories of products get excluded and be exempt from the tariffs. The biggest one, I think, in terms of both unit and dollar value would be those 3 categories of kids' bikes. A number of these were exclusions. These kind of covered the gambit. Some of these were exclusions that PeopleForBikes and individual companies applied for. Some of these are just individual companies that applied for and got these. So I'm summarizing holistically here. The e-bike exclusion, e-bikes are categorized actually in the motor vehicle section of the tariff schedule. They're not in the bike section of the tariff schedule. So the e-bike exclusion ended up getting granted as a result of an electric motorcycle exclusion that was granted to a couple small companies in Louisiana and Missouri. and e-bikes ended up falling within the article description that was provided as a result of that exclusion. And that one has been extended as well. But some major categories here: helmets. We've been emphasizing the safety aspect that we think the Trade Representative's Office should consider when reviewing these extensively, and lights too. So we did very well in this exclusion process to get as much relief as I think was possible for the industry when that was open. Financially, you know, what does this mean? It's a difficult number to tally for sure, because of the way, you know, I don't know what everybody's doing with their protests and amending their post summary orders and all these things like that, filing post summary corrections to actually recoup all this money. But this is a figure, $130 million, that just reflects the product exclusions that PeopleForBikes filed. It doesn't reflect the other ones that other companies were granted, and that ultimately would have saved the industry some money as well. I'm just trying to capture how much money PeopleForBikes direct work in terms of filing things was able to save the industry. A big chunk of this obviously comes from the kids bike exclusions, which were you know, a concerted effort by both PeopleForBikes and a lot of its members to get a number of requests in on that product. But the financial benefits have been significant. So exclusion extensions, you know, this has, I think, been frustrating for a lot of companies that these product exclusions are short-term in nature. Most of them were issued for about 1 year, some for a little bit less. The Trade Representative's Office has sort of changed the way it's been issuing these exclusions over time. At first, it was just always issuing them for a year from the date of publication. As time went on, I think that became a little complicated, and there were too many rolling expiration dates. So they started just setting set expiration dates for each list. So like all of the list 3 exclusions expired August 7th. There wasn't this rolling basis like they had for list 1 and 2. So what that meant in practice was the exclusions that got granted earlier on felt like they were in effect for longer, but in reality, they're all retroactive. So unless you had a problem where you had an entry where your timeline to file a protest had expired, there are some timing issues there. For the most part, the ability to recoup was relatively similar, even if they had different kind of publication dates. So as these expiration dates approached, the Trade Representative's Office opened up another public comment process. And this was actually pretty similar to the exclusion process. It's pretty detailed again. You had to provide a decent amount of information. Some of it was not required like it was the first time, which was a little bit helpful. But what you really had to demonstrate was why you should receive more time with an exemption, which meant explaining why it was difficult to resource your product, why it was not possible to source that product from other locations, if you'd made efforts to look for that product domestically. These were the types of factors that were USTR was really honing in on in that analysis. And this ties into the reason for these exclusions being temporary. USTR has always maintained that the idea here was to give companies that needed it a longer runway to provide or to identify new sourcing production areas for their products. They were never intended to be permanent. The extensions are short-term. They're only through the end of this year. There was initially discussion as to whether they'd go beyond that, but every product exclusion extension that's been granted is going to expire on December 31. So we've gone through this product for all of our core core goods. Our initial exclusions all expired in either August or September of this year. I don't need to break this down in too much detail, so we can just move along to the next one, Lindsay. And so here are the results of those efforts. Again, we did a really concerted mixed effort on behalf of PFB and all of our member companies to provide these extension comments. So, you know, I drafted a lot of these and submitted them through the online portal, but also helped our members as they went through the same process. It's one of those things where for most products, the more input you get, the better. And we did very well in the extension process as well. On a whole, for, you know, looking at these Section 301 exclusions globally, about 25 or 30% of the initial exclusions were extended to the end of this year. And we ended up closer to about 50% of all of our product exclusions being extended, including some of the ones for really big categories like kids bikes and e-bikes. Unfortunately, we did only get one of the helmet exclusions. I'm not sure why the safety justifications weren't quite as compelling as USTR reviewed these applications, but we did do quite well. And I think in terms of dollars, we probably well exceeded 50% of the dollar value categories getting extended. So the last piece I want to touch on here is the Section 301 litigation. You've probably read about this or maybe seen our alerts on this. Thousands of lawsuits have now been filed against the US government, most of them in September of this year, challenging the Section 301 tariffs. The core arguments here are that these tariffs are unlawful. The president, or as implemented by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, has violated his authority under the Trade Act of 1974. The claim is that law does not provide the executive branch with sort of unfettered authority to engage in a long-term trade war with tariffs of this magnitude, and that the procedures that act requires when imposing new tariffs haven't been followed. Similarly, there's also allegations concerning the Administrative Procedure Act and whether the procedures that act requires when taking this type of action have been followed as well, whether there was proper notice and comment for all the different rounds and things of that nature. If these are successful, those who have filed claims could receive substantial tariff recovery. Obviously, that's a major wild card. It's probably an uphill road to win these lawsuits. But if you don't file, you're not going to get those recouped tariffs. It's possible that in a forward-looking sense, there may be some ability for non-filers to recover, but that's the reason why so many of these things flooded in, is companies wanted to protect or preserve their ability to recoup tariffs they've already been paying in the past if these lawsuits were successful. All right. I'm gonna fly through our next set of items pretty fast because I want to keep this within our time window. The miscellaneous tariffs bill. What is this? What is this thing? It's a process that we have used for a very long time in the United States to provide tariff relief on goods that we don't make in the US, basically. The idea here is if we don't make the product domestically, and especially if it's an input for another product, we should make sure that people who produce goods in the US can get those inputs less expensively. This was historically done through a lot of individual bills. That process was criticized very heavily under the kind of pork barrel philosophy. Representatives or senators in a nice position could help their companies that were their constituents, and other people would lose out, and it wasn't very fair or balanced. So that was overhauled in 2016, and Congress kind of punted this analysis to the U.S. International Trade Commission and made it much more administrative. So now the International Trade Commission just reviews all the petitions that are submitted and reviews them for their merits based on if there's US production or not, what the financial impacts are, and whether they think customs can administer the relief that's being sought easily. Here's the timeline. We've gone through a lot of this already. Petitions needed to be submitted by the end of last year. ITC has been reviewing these petitions over the last 9 months or so, and it's finally released its final report to Congress. And so Congress, the ball is firmly in Congress's court now. They need to take the recommendations that ITC provided to them and turn it into legislation, pass that legislation, and have the president sign it. That's usually not a controversial bill. They just sort of adopt what ITC's recommended when they did this in the 2016 round. And without any real changes. So it's more just a matter of Congress getting to it as opposed to there being substantive conflicts about the legislation. So what we did this cycle is we made a much more concerted push to get more products, to submit more product petitions for the miscellaneous tariffs bill. You can see what the bike industry has done in the past has been relatively limited. There are some big categories on there for disc brakes. But for the most part, we didn't really apply for all that much. So we really did an analysis this time of products that we didn't think had much US production, and tried to go after as many of them as we could. Sometimes we broke those things down into separate subcategories due to that $500,000 cap. So like for pedals, there were separate petitions for clipless pedals and platform pedals, which enables you to sort of stretch that dollar limit a little bit further. But on the whole, a more ambitious set of petitions this time around. And again, we had a lot of success so far in terms of what ITC's recommended. There were 25 petitions total that were related to bike products, and 23 of those have been recommended for approval. Again, because of that $500,000 cap, you can kind of get only so much benefit out of this. So, you know, when you compare it to like the amount of money saved by the Section 301 exclusions, it's not in the same ballpark, obviously, but it is significant. 19 million is projected to be saved based on what USITC is projected for the import values of those categories between 2021 and 2023. And again, we still need to have legislation on this. It's likely that Congress will not deal with this until 2021, and they'll make that relief retroactive. So if you're importing any of these products that have been recommended for approval, you need to watch those, because you may need to amend your entries or even file a protest if this happens later in 2021. But you've maybe already paid the tariff, or your entry is logged as not getting any relief for that product. GSP, I mentioned this one already. Again, this is a trade program that is supposed to encourage investments in developing countries, providing tariff relief for them. There are a few countries on the GSP list that are really relevant to bike manufacturing, particularly Cambodia. That's obviously a big one. A question I get a lot is if Vietnam is a GSP country. It is not. I know Vietnam is getting looked at a lot as a production source in light of everything that's going on with China, but it is not part of GSP.
Awesome. And really quick before we move on, Alex, I'm just going to encourage people to start dropping your questions into the chat from anything that you've heard. And we'll take about the last 5 minutes to do those. All right, to you, Alex.
Thanks, Lindsay. So with GSP, this is actually a program that Congress authorizes through legislation, and the current authorization for GSP expires at the end of this year. So this has happened in the past. It happens every few years. It's very likely that Congress will renew GSP as they have in the past, but as they did the last time they did it, they probably won't do it on time. So this probably won't happen before December 31st. It will probably happen in 2021 and then be retroactive to January 1, 2021. So in terms of the substantive effect, there won't be a lag in your ability to claim relief if you're importing goods from GSP countries, but it'll require you to monitor the administrative process for if you need to amend entries or file protests or anything like that again, because it's not going to be perfectly executed in terms of keeping that authorization in effect. At least that doesn't appear to be what's going to happen before the end of the year. EU civil aircraft dispute. This was also a Section 301 investigation, and the underlying issue, again, was not connected to the bike industry. It's about a dispute between the US and the EU over the EU improperly subsidizing Airbus at the expense of Boeing. So what happened that's relevant to our industry? A 25% tariff was proposed on hubs and cassettes. This was a few different tariff headings. And it wasn't a huge increase, but again, you know, we weren't part of this conflict, and we didn't really see how tariffs on the bike industry were going to help resolve this issue between on civil aircraft subsidies. These have been proposed 3 times. Every 6 months, the U.S. Trade Representative goes back and looks at the tariffs that are in effect on different products from the EU and decides if he wants to change that list. So we have to be very vigilant about monitoring this and providing pretty lengthy comments, frankly, each time it comes up. It takes a lot of time to do all these and explain why we don't think bike products should be dragged into this conflict. So we'll probably be doing that again in about January, I think. So 2021, obviously there's a lot going on in the trade space. These are a few of our biggest priorities for 2021. We do want to work to reduce the Section 301 tariffs, whether that means continuing to extend our product exclusions, finding new opportunities to have products removed from that. You know, I think a big issue right now is what's going to happen with the election. Our expectation is that at least if we do have a change in administration as a result of the election, we're not expecting these Section 301 tariffs to go away, at least not quickly. You know, I think if we do have a change and Mr. Biden is to win, certainly there'll be a different approach towards China, probably a more multilateral approach. these tariffs will pose a number of sort of issues. You know, the WTO has entered a ruling saying they weren't imposed correctly. I'm sure the EU has thoughts about whether we should follow the WTO rulings, and he'll be trying to build a coalition. So there'll be a lot of factors for a new administration to navigate, and I don't think an immediate repeal of these is something that's realistic. What happens longer term is a much more open question. The miscellaneous tariffs bill, obviously we want Congress to pass the current US ITC recommendations. Those are good for our industry to get some relief on some of these component categories. But we also want to see the program reauthorized. When Congress created this new process for the miscellaneous tariffs bill, it only authorized ITC to write 2 reports. The first one started back in 2016 with the final report coming out in 2017, and the second one was this year. So currently there's no process in place after this to deal with what happens with miscellaneous tariffs. If they don't do anything, it would go back to this old procedure of just passing individual bills. We don't think that's going to happen. They're very likely to renew the MTB legislation and continue this ITC report style, though there could be some changes that we're watching really closely, particularly if finished goods can be eligible. And then GSP, this obviously needs to get dealt with, and we'd like to see a longer term reauthorization. We've heard some rumors about a shorter term proposal. We'd like to see a longer one. Other issues to watch, I mentioned the EU civil aircraft dispute. We'll probably see more proposals related to that probably before the end of the year, December, January, and will probably be proposed again, I would guess, and have to submit more comments. Also, the issue of de minimis is getting some more attention as a result of the Section 301 tariffs. De minimis is a piece of legislation that allows shipments that are valued at less than $800 to come in to the United States duty-free. Every country has a de minimis level, but our $800 level is very, very high. Most countries are more like $50 to $200. So this is a pretty big advantage to direct-to-consumer foreign retailers who are able to bypass tariffs on a pretty lofty level of purchases. This is getting a lot of renewed attention due to Section 301 because the current guidance from Customs on this issue is that de minimis doesn't only allow the importer to avoid the base tariff, it also allows them to avoid the Section 301 tariff. So if you have a company doing a big shipment, they're paying 36% on bikes, and a direct-to-consumer importer, if it's less than $800, paying 0. So there's a huge difference there, and that's causing a lot of consternation and making the administration look at whether there's anything they can do. A bigger picture change on this is difficult because it would require legislation, a new bill from Congress signed by the president, and this was only changed in about 2015. So we're not sure what that looks like, but it's an issue we're watching closely. And then new Section 301 investigations. The most recent one that was published is about Vietnam for currency manipulation practices. You know, if the current administration wins the election, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we continued to see Section 301 investigations pushed out. And these obviously have a lot of relevance for our industry because we get dragged into these disputes indirectly through tariffs on our goods.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Alex. So I apologize, everyone. We're running a little bit over, but we are going to take 5 more minutes to do questions if you have them. So feel free to stick around or jump out. We won't be offended. And you can use the Q&A feature or just drop directly into the chat. And after this, if you have any additional questions, feel free to hit up Alex at PeopleForBikes.org with anything additional. Okay, so jumping into our first question. This one came through yesterday. Our company has been a BPSA member for many years, but only a recent member of PFB. 2 questions. So the first one is, PFB has been aggressive in opposing the Section 301 tariffs on Chinese goods. Can you explain PFB's approach in deciding how to respond on behalf of the industry for this issue?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lindsay. And, you know, I think this, this particular sort of campaign, if you want to call it that, has been a lot more visible than a lot of trade issues the industry has worked on in the past. And particularly since our merger with the BPSA, certainly the highest profile trade-related issue that we've been engaged on. You know, I've noted a lot of other things that we've done, but I don't think we haven't done as many alerts. We haven't been as public about what we've been doing as we have on the Section 301 tariffs. So, you know, the first thing I'd say is we're absolutely guided by our members. So when a new issue comes up that we're worried about, I'm our staff lead for the Legal Legislative Safety Subcommittee within our BPSA Trade Association Committee, and we talk about it there, and we say, how big of a deal is this? What do we need to be doing? And certainly the overwhelming feedback from our members has been, this is a huge deal, and you need to do everything you possibly can. So that's sort of our first, you know, guidepost to say, you know, what does the industry need from us on this? We don't dictate where we're going. We go where the industry needs us to go. The other piece was that I was thinking about, particularly as staff here, was making sure that, you know, if what we do here is consistent with what we're willing to do in other areas, so that if we see tariffs proposed on goods from Taiwan tomorrow, we're willing to do the same kind of thing. And even though it hasn't been as visible, you know, I think our actions on the EU civil aircraft dispute reflect that. We've been very aggressive in lobbying against those changes going into effect, even though it's not a huge dollar amount relatively. It's not as many companies that are effective, but our approach has been identical, and that's that if you're proposing punitive tariffs on our industry in a dispute that we have nothing to do with, and that we think is going to drive up prices, we're opposed to it, and we're going to fight it.
Great. And another follow-up, part two of that first question related to China and e-bikes. E-bikes enter the U.S. on a duty-free basis, except for the recent tariffs against Chinese-made e-bikes. Have you considered lobbying for all bicycle tariffs to be removed? And let me know if you've already answered that.
Not exactly, but it's, you know, it's not a good question. So, you know, the tariff on most complete bikes is 11%. There are a few at 5.5%. That's kind of the road hybrid bike style that's at that lower rate. That's probably not something that's possible without buy-in from Congress. I think that would be really tricky politically. It might also be tricky from a membership perspective as well, given that we do have some U.S. bike production, and sort of changing the baseline that we've been operating at for a long time might be a hard conversation with some of our members, and we'd have to take that into consideration, obviously. But I think the point that's being raised is whether we are doing anything that would sort of help make e-bikes more accessible and maybe less expensive for the people who are buying them. And we're actually trying to do that, but in a different way. And that's working on legislation for e-bike subsidies. So we've got a few different work projects floating around at different levels of government, including one at the federal level, but also at the state and local level, trying to get more e-bike incentive programs in place. And I think that's actually doing the same thing that's at the core of that question, which is what can we do to try and make it easier for Americans to get their hands on bikes? Great,
thank you. And question from Wayne, will the 12/31 tariff exclusion extensions automatically expire and be re-implemented after this date without further action?
That's an interesting question. So what's automatically? Not necessarily. What's sort of strange about this extension process is some of the exclusions were renewed despite there being no comments. I don't know why that was. You'd think you'd have to at least put a comment, you know, in support of the exclusion being extended to get that, but that wasn't always the case. So, but however, I think most of them that did not receive any comments one way or the other were terminated. So it would not be wise to fail to avail ourselves of whatever process the U.S. Trade Representative's Office implements between now and the end of the year. There hasn't been a notice from them yet on what that'll look like. I'm assuming it will look pretty similar to what happened last time, and we'll have to file a lot of documentation again about what's going on with our industry and justify why they should be extended beyond December 31. I think it's going to get more difficult every single round they go through this too, because of the idea that's underlying the exclusions, which is that the idea is you just get a little more time to source, to shift your supply chain. And if you don't do it, you have to start paying the tariff. So I think each time we go through this, it's going to get harder and harder and harder to do, but we will have to follow the administrative procedures that get put in place if we want to have a chance.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And you hit on a question from Shane as well. So well done. We're going to take two more and then jump off before 1:40 and plan for more time next time to talk about tariffs. So next question of the last two, how can PFB members support the tariff work?
Great question. You know, one of the things that we're doing and that would be extremely beneficial is if you got in contact with myself and Noah Banyan, who is our federal affairs manager out in Washington, D.C. And we are doing a lot of meetings up on the Hill right now between brands and their members of Congress talking about the tariffs, because we don't know what's going to happen with this election, but we want to have a platform with Congress, members of Congress being informed about our issues and what's going on with the Section 301 tariffs and our industry, because their input is going to be important. So it's an education process for one, but there are a lot of members of Congress who have a lot of influence, and their input really does matter. So while we can handle some of the administrative pieces on our side, that's really important, because just having Noah go have a meeting every single day with the same office is not as compelling as their constituent going in and talking about their business and talking about exactly what the tariffs have done to their business.
Great. I love it. Use your voice as industry members. We appreciate you guys. Okay, final question. Do we have any sense, and this is coming from Matt, do we have any sense of whether a new administration might roll back the 301 tariffs and what that process would be? And yes, the election is to be decided.
Obviously. Yeah, I've touched on this a little bit. Again, I don't think an immediate rollback is in the cards. It's going to take a new administration some time to kind of find their footing here and figure out what approach they want to take towards China and how these tariffs fit into that approach, and what the pressure is from other nations about how we've rolled these out, during this administration. So there's a lot of things in play there. Administratively, I don't, certainly the administration has taken kind of a unilateral approach in imposing the tariffs. So, I think similarly, it could be a little bit more unilateral in the executive branch withdrawing them. We might not need to see anything beyond that, but the administration would need to get there and think that that's the direction they want to take. So that's probably the trickier piece.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate you dropping in a little bit about yourself as well as your questions. That was a fun way to kick things off. So yeah, again, if you have further follow-up, please email Alex directly at alex@peopleforbikes.org. And Jordan, if you wouldn't mind dropping that email address in the chat one more time. And then our next webinar is November 17th. So we'll see you soon. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.